Well, the refurbishment of the Koeberg Nuclear Power Station has been delayed for so long. The City Press newspaper reporting yesterday that Eskom and the contractor who's supposed to be doing the job, the French company Framatome, are involved in disputes. The newspaper also says, in fact, the delays have been so long, Eskom has enforced penalty clauses as a result. The company is now going to make a loss on the project. According to City Press, massive parts of Koeberg, weighing over 300 tons, had to be flown to China to be fixed. Peter Becker is with the Koeberg Alliance Group. Peter, good afternoon to you. I mean, some of the facts that are beginning to come out are astounding. Where did all of the problems with this Koeberg refurbishment actually start?
Hi, good to be with you again. Well, I think, to put it simply, this is a question of organizational incompetence and a cover-up of that and the wasteful expenditure that's occurred at the plant. And while saying that, I think it's important to acknowledge you just mentioned, the dedicated people who do work at Eskom and do their level best. But that is putting it simply. It's organizational incompetence and a cover-up. And we can tell it's a cover-up because Minister Ramaphosa, who you mentioned just now, himself went to Koeberg and asked for a presentation about the reasons for the delays and what's going on there. And in his words, he was none the wiser when he left.
Sure. To have a situation where the contractor and Eskom are in a dispute, I mean, that sounds really serious. And there are not many people who do this kind of work. If the contractor walks away, we're all in serious trouble.
Yeah. I don't think it's unusual for there to be some claims and counterclaims when a contract of this size happens, but it's a very extreme example of this. So there are approximately 130 claims outstanding between the two companies where they're blaming each other for this and that. One of the ones that was well published was the 1.1 billion claim from Framatome against Eskom, because when they came out in 2022 to do the attempted refurbishment, Eskom wasn't ready for them. There was a building missing. So that resulted in a claim of 1.1 billion. But that's just one out of the 130 claims that are busy going on at the moment.
There's a ticking clock, a ticking clock here, right? If they don't get things done in time, we actually end up in a very serious position because otherwise Koeberg will lose its license. Or was, for some reason, nobody worried about its losing its license?
Well, I think the problem is that it's being taken offline now, not a concern about it going offline in 2025. So the two units were started up about 17 months apart. So although the license expires in July 2024 for the entire plant, Eskom has requested the NNR to allow one of the units to continue running for perhaps a year longer. So in fact, Unit 2 could still be running for the next 2 years. But what is going on is we've seen since that first unit was taken offline, Unit 2, the first attempt in 2022, we've lost 1,000 megawatts of power from the grid. And I was listening to Minister Ramaphosa's presentation over the weekend, and he proudly announced how they've managed to claw back 500 megawatts of capacity through maintenance and so on. But now we have a situation where it is so easy to have 1,000 megawatts extra available on the grid. And that is simply by overriding Eskom's plan to take Unit 2 offline starting in November this year for 250 odd days, something like that. And the reason they're doing that is in order to extend its life beyond the 2025 date. But we know by looking at the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan and various other things, I know Chris Yelland made an estimate that by 2026, we're going to have 31,000 megawatts of new capacity on the grid. Now, Koeberg's 2,000 megawatts is going to be irrelevant by 2026. But what Eskom is doing is taking the units offline for extended outages now at the precise time we need them the most in order to have them running at a time we're not going to need them at all.
So in other words, this is really an argument about the present versus the future. The opportunity cost of running it now is that you wouldn't have it in the future. The license would expire because you didn't do the refurbishment, if I've understood this correctly. You're suggesting we won't need it. I can imagine Eskom finding that quite contentious because they would then lose the use of what for them has been a really valuable asset.
Yes, I guess it has been valuable, perhaps reliable, no. If you look at the output from the plant over the last 5 years, the output's been up and down as the units have tripped, been refurbished, come online, gone offline again. So I think there's a question of value to Eskom, and then there's a question of value to the country. So an example of that is by taking a 6-month outage of one unit, if we work on the CSIR figure of 87 Rand per kilowatt hour of unserved energy, 6 months is costing the economy 311 billion Rand. Now, that doesn't appear on Eskom's balance sheet. So I think we need to look at a bigger picture than what's valuable to Eskom and say what is the best decision for the country.
I suppose the other thing would be, one of the things about nuclear power is that most of the cost is up front and then it's relatively cheap to run. I realize that there are other costs, Peter, and we need to take those into account. But, I mean, for Eskom, could they not say, yes, we've seen, what the Renewable Master Plan says, but in fact, this is reliable power, generally speaking. It's always on power. There's a big argument about whether it helps to balance the grid or not. I know you believe it doesn't. That it's not necessary for that. But wouldn't the argument go, this is one of those moments that's worth investing in keeping this facility running because over time, over the next 30 years, there's actually relatively cheap electricity?
Right. So in order to make that decision, one would normally do a business plan and have a look at the business case for the expenditure. But unfortunately, because of the cover-up and the atmosphere of secrecy that Eskom keeps around the whole Koeberg subject, we don't know what that cost is going to be. So back in 2010, the board of Eskom made the decision that the life extension made economic sense, and they had a business plan, and they estimated the cost would be 20 billion Rand. Now, I think we all know that something that made sense in 2010 does not necessarily make sense in 2023. So that business case should really be looked at again. And despite the fact that Eskom have acknowledged publicly that 20 billion is no longer an accurate estimate, they've refused to release what that figure currently is. And if you simply look at inflation between 2010 and now, we know that as an absolute minimum, that figure must have doubled. But we also know that the exchange rate was 7.50 Rand to the dollar back in 2010. That must have had some effect on it. We also know that they estimated the work would take 5 months per unit. It's now taking 18 months per unit, and those dates constantly slip. So that's more than 3 times as long. And because of the exchange rate, it might be 3 times more expensive. And because of simple inflation, it might be twice as expensive. So the 20 billion Rand we know for sure is wrong. The estimates are difficult to make because Eskom won't release information, but I personally wouldn't be surprised if the total cost, if you really include everything, including the claims by Framatome, the 200 million legal costs here and there, that it could cost 100 billion Rand for that job. Now, then we need to ask, if Eskom were to spend 100 billion Rand, bearing in mind it's been bailed out by Treasury, what is the most beneficial way for it to spend that money? To maintain 2,000 megawatts of capacity via a risky project, economically risky project, or is it perhaps best to spend that money strengthening the grid to allow the new capacity to not be constrained by grid problems?
Peter, who actually is making the decisions here? I know Eskom has a chief nuclear officer. Is it that person? Is it the board? Could this go to the minister? And I realize this is complicated, but which minister would it go to?
That's an excellent question. And I think a symptom of the confusion around that point is the fact that Minister Ramaphosa can't work it out. Despite having the authority, despite appointed by the president, despite being a very educated man and an engineer, I believe, he went to Koeberg and he asked for a long presentation. He received one and he was none the wiser. So clearly somebody is pulling the wool over somebody's eyes about the project and what is going on there.
Peter Becker of the Koeberg Alliance Group, really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed.